So I'm going to introduce our panel now. We have Cathy Mager, who is an artist and founder of Spectroscope, a disabled-led studio creating immersive artworks for arts and public spaces worldwide. Spectroscope presents visions of what is to come, immersing audiences within dreamscapes that explore what our future world may look and feel like. Cathy, over to you to introduce yourself in a little bit more detail.
Hello, I'm Cathy. I am a middle-aged woman with blonde hair, shoulder-length hair. I'm wearing a blue top. I have a blurred background. I live in Bristol and I run a Spectroscope but I've been a curator and a producer for 20 years, working primarily in the mainstream organisations, working on non-disabled projects. But 5 years ago, I decided that I wanted to set up my own company led by deaf and disabled people. And there's been an amazing roller coaster of activity since then, which this space has formed a very central part because they helped to set the chain of events in motion to enable me to kickstart my own company. So I look forward to sharing some of the things we've been working on with you all.
Brilliant. Thank you, Cathy. And then we have Aidan Moesby, who is an artist and curator, bringing an emotionally nuanced context to climate change and the deep interconnectedness between the natural and social environments. His projects foreground care, access, and inclusion, and include conversations which act as a catalyst for positive social action and change. Over to you, Aidan, to introduce yourself properly.
Yeah, hi, I'm Aidan Moesby. I'm a middle-aged man with white hair, glasses, extremely pale skin, and a light beard from Newcastle, and I've got a blurred background. Yeah, I'm an interdisciplinary artist and curator making emotionally nuanced work. A weather obsessive and use it as a metaphor and framework to explore and make sense of the world, particularly exploring emotional weather. And much of the art that I make is a starting point for social conversations, which hopefully act as a catalyst for climate and social justice, particularly around disability justice and mental health. Last year, I curated Towards New Worlds with Mima, which featured 15 disabled neurodivergent deaf artists, which focused on the critical robustness of the work rather than just the lived experience. I'm currently completing a practice-based PhD in climate change art and well-being at Teesside with a neurodivergent and disability context. And I'm also a resident of Pervasive Media Studio at the Watershed in Bristol.
Brilliant. Thank you, Aidan. And then finally, we have Joseph Wilk, who is a London-born artist and programmer who uses the digital to explore disability and disability to explore the digital. He deconstructs, misuses, and repurposes software and hardware to challenge notions of ownership and visibility. Joseph, over to you to introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm a 40-year-old white male with fading blue hair, red glasses, a very pink scarf, and a black top with a blurry background. I kind of, as an artist, as a programmer, I do a lot of work around disabled imagination, around deconstructing technology, and exploring disability. Both technology and disability is really I'm exploring deconstructing systems and exploring power and beliefs and often how those are enforced on people and what it's like to resist them.
Brilliant. Thank you, Joe. So, over to our first question, which is to you, Cathy. Your work in large-scale immersive installations that reveals deaf heritage and is driven by social activism is really fascinating. Tell us more about how your practice is innovative.
Um, as someone who's worked in museums and galleries for 20 years, I'm kind of like the other side. So that's the people, the movers and shakers within those institutions who don't work or collaborate with disabled people. I was on that side of the fence for many years. Um, I've been trying through my work to bring work by deaf and disabled people into new spaces and to dominate public spaces in new ways and to bring audiences into that. So this year we've been working on a number of different projects, and one of them has been a collaboration with the Science Gallery, and that was a group show of international artists exploring themes around climate change. And we had an installation within that. It was called Vital Signs, Another World is Possible. And that was an amazing experience to be part of, and to be part of a cross-section of discussion around climate change, mathematics, the very, very detailed, nuanced discussions around what's going on in biodiversity emergency globally, and alongside a whole real interesting array of artists who are looking at things like sewage and the materials and the indigenous communities of certain countries, and we were sitting within all of that. Our story was about a group of Chinese people, a group of deaf people in China, who had had their homes destroyed in the 1960s. Yeah, so an international collaboration between Chinese and UK artists came together to create an artwork called Night Bloom. And it's a very layered work that takes upon a story of an elderly population of Chinese people who in the 1960s lost their homes but continued to meet in a park for 50 years. And we took that story to reference the way in which they've survived as a community of people within a natural environment, and took that into a very complex digital artwork that was layered with work by disabled musicians, disabled performers, and with botanical archives, and also drawings by disabled Chinese artists. And we brought this together. It's like we had about a 20-strong deaf and disabled team. And we brought this together to create this immersive projection work for the Science Gallery. And that work has also travelled to China itself and been projected onto the National Bank of China in Shanghai, and also been developed into a 360-degree immersive work. So it's a really complex, I like to think, brilliant piece of work that has been entirely led by deaf and disabled people, empowered through from a very authentic, story. And but it has sat within a global discussion of like very serious academics and artists, and and it had its place there, and it deserved to be there, and it mattered, and it made sense that it was present in that space. And it shouldn't be innovative for that to be the case, because disability is everywhere, and it is should be a central part of the climate change and biodiversity discussions, because disabled people, more than anyone, are the people best placed to talk about survival in the face of adversity. But it is innovative in that way, and I hope that we will be doing more of this kind of work in future with institutions like Science Gallery.
Brilliant. Thank you, Cathy. I love that it's not just about breaking those assumptions and building a team of practitioners together to make the work that you do, but you're also redefining what immersive as an art form is as well. And that's really, really exciting, merging deaf heritage and culture with new forms of tech. And Aidan, I'm going to move to you. Your work uses art and tech to also explore big themes around social justice and climate change and well-being. How are you breaking boundaries?
Phew. Yeah, I mean, breaking boundaries. I still like pencil and paper as technology, so perhaps that's boundary breaking. I generally don't use tech as a thing in itself. It's part of the work, but not all of the work, and it helps me achieve what I want to do and what I want that work to do. And also, I kind of have a love-hate relationship with technology. I generally don't like black box technology or the distance that sometimes technology can create with a work. So I'm thinking of a work that I made between Stillness and Storm, which was a live installation, which was a responded live to the current weather situation, and so that I made solar powered synthesizers, and you could see all the circuitry, and there was a swarm of synthesizers, and you could touch the solar panels, and you could see if the invitation was there to like get up close and personal. So if you touch the solar panels and stop the light getting to it, then it would become silent. And so you could see the direct relationship between like the energy of the sun and the impact on like the sound that created, and also with a wind mediated bell tree. So the faster the wind blew, the faster the sequence of bells, and it was completely off grid. So it's kind of one is it's the invitation to touch and feel, and to and hopefully through that become more kind of inclusive, but also around the like the technology and the consequences of technology and the wider relationships of like the environment, and how we can, and as a gateway to conversations as well about like, oh, the sun can power this, and so what else can it power, or the wind can power these bells. And yeah, and so it's the kind of gentle ways in. You're not saying this is about climate change, this is about mental health. It's like, oh, look, there's some, bells and weather balloons. And so you're presenting something else. It's a bit like, look over there, but let's really talk about this. And also, as a resident at Pervasive Media Studio, did a residency a few years ago with disabled artists. Um, Through Unlimited with other artists from disabled artists from Australia. And some of us produced this work called Nothing to See, which was using conductive ink, which acted as a trigger to an Arduino and then would play sound or video. But again, this work didn't really exist unless it was touched. And it's kind of challenging that notion that there has to be a separateness and a preciousness about art, and that there's got to be, and that this distance. But how can I make work about access and inclusion and democratization and justice if there's a separateness, and that you're not allowed to touch it and engage it? And by touching and engaging it kind of helps create these kind of conversations or a safer space, and that people feel able to be in that space and welcome, and not like the rarefied air of the hallowed white cubes. And yeah, and much of the technology that I use requires very little tech skills and low cost, and that can open up worlds for people, and hopefully it begins to include people in dialogues of climate and societal change. And and I want to democratize the tech, so those using things which are easily used, cheap, abundant, and often using household materials, which is just adapted. And yeah, and hopefully that can kind of engender a conversation through this democratization, and kind of yeah, think more about justice, both societal and climate. So it's kind of going back to basics to break those boundaries and taboos of you can't do that.
Brilliant. I love that, Aidan. It kind of reminds me of like hacker culture, kind of experimenting with things, really from what you have around you, to kind of understand the world. It's really playful and curious, but like you say, it's exploring massively big and deep challenges that we're facing, and it gives people the opportunity to experience those from wherever they're coming into it from their own lived experiences. And that's really nice. It takes the kind of responsibility away, and allows them to engage in a really beautiful and subtle way. Thank you, Aidan. And over to you, Joe. So, when we spoke before, you told me about how you use technology as a medium rather than a focus to explore various aspects of disabled experience. Tell us more about how you're doing that.
Yeah. So I'm a programmer by background, and I kind of think programming is my medium. Technology is inherently political and is very difficult to use, because it's designed to be used in a very specific way. So often my work is about trying to break that. I find a kind of a good analogy for technology comes from disability for me, as in the wheelchair icon, which shows you that spaces in public have disabled access, is a badge that tells you you belong, but the disabled experience is actually discovering that most of the time it's not, because the badge is there as a signal, but the actual system is not providing that access. And I find that's exactly the same with technology, that it's told, like Microsoft will quite happily tell you how AI is helping disabled people's lives better. And again, there's a mismatch between the actual system and the structures that are not addressing that. And a lot of my work and a lot of my relevant kind of recent work has been a project called CryptShip. The tagline, "Disability Saves Society from Big Technology," with a very specific focus on how AI doesn't work and how AI discriminates and causes great harm to the planet in its pollution, and to the workers who have to sift the data, and to the discriminatory systems that are created with it. And as well as being very critical, this game is also a space and is led by a disabled experience perspective around exploring storytelling in disability. So again, that's like where tech is part of this project, and it's a critique of AI, but it's also a space for disabled people to explore what is disabled imagination, what is disabled fantasy, and kind of using that as a lens to break apart generative AI systems and show how terrible they are, and how if there's anything good about them, it's that they perfectly codify everything that's wrong with society that discriminates and ableism in this one big thing that disabled people can poke at, that anyone can poke at, and just realize that this exemplifies how none of the problems of society are being addressed, like climate, like ableism, like many of those aspects. And this game CryptShip and my lens is providing that space for people to both be creative, storytelling, imagine disabled futures, play, activism, resistance, community building, and really making sure that people understand that these systems are political and they're not designed for disabled people's benefit. They're designed to extract profit.
Yeah, that's fascinating, Joe. And I think there's so much hype around AI at the moment. And so it's really interesting when artists like yourself are, exploring what that means from your own perspectives. And also, I think the way you set up CryptShip, as a game, an invitation to play together, it allows all of us to come in and challenge those assumptions. Like sometimes we don't really know what our own biases are, like that whole thing of how do I know what my biases are, or how do I know how society has conditioned me to have certain stereotypes and views. And you don't know until it's like really put in front of your face. And often the best way to do that is to play in that space and interact in that space. So to be able to do that, it's absolutely brilliant. It's fascinating to be able to challenge people's own ideas of what they have been exposed to, and then how they respond to that. I think that's really interesting. And I'm just going to move to the chat to see if we've got any questions. Hold on. Oh, yes. So we've got a comment from Sorsha. I hope I've pronounced your name correctly, who is a blind artist. And she says that she finds tech creates barriers for me as an independent creator, but I want to use it to extend interaction beyond my own experiences. Do the artists have any experiences or advice of how to do this really well? How to use tech to extend interaction beyond their own experiences?
Yeah, I would like to say that I am not like a coder. My technical knowledge is relatively limited, and there's this idea that we have to do everything ourselves. And partly like being a pervasive media studio, it's like full of people who can, oh, I can do that. And it's like, and so you can have the idea, or you can, and it also fosters collaborative work and things like that. So it's finding ways to get the idea across, and if that is working with somebody else who has the skills to to kind of bring your vision to life. Yeah, use them and talk to other people. You don't have to do everything. All the way back from the masters, people have been getting other people to help them with their work.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. Is about like who can you collaborate with, on a level, even if it's just to experiment and to start tinkering with. And Aidan, you've mentioned that you do that. Cathy, you've mentioned that you do that, and Joe, I'm guessing that you also collaborate with others when you make work, although you're kind of as a programmer and a developer, you've got more your skills in your hat. Cathy, did I see your hand up? Go on. Oh, you're on mute. Hold on, we'll try and unmute you. Um, I don't think we can unmute you. Hold on a second. That's all right. We'll work out how to unmute Cathy, or Cathy, you can try and see if you can find a way to unmute yourself. And the irony of working with technology in your practice is that actually sometimes even doing a Zoom is very challenging. So hold on a second. We're trying, the team says we're trying to unmute you, but we can't. Oh, okay. We've lost Cathy, but I'm sure she'll turn up again in a second.
Shall
And
I
I think, yeah, go
shall I
on, Joe.
jump in with an answer?
Yeah.
I just have a well, maybe wait. So I think, like it said, like extending reaction beyond my own experiences means that designing it for other people's experiences, which means making sure you design with those people rather than for them, right? So that's firstly like, who is it for? And are they in the room to discuss how they want it to be? And I think the other aspect I would add is that technology doesn't lead. Like technology facilitates, and sometimes that can be difficult. But ultimately, what is the purpose of the experience? What are you trying to achieve? What are you trying to say? And I think that Aidan catch that perfectly. Maybe paper and pencil is the right technology. Maybe VR is the right technology. Those are both completely viable options. It's the experience that is the most important aspect.
Brilliant. Thank you, Joe. And I like that in terms of defining, who's this for? Um, and starting from the simplest point. Cathy, you're back. And I was just going to
Right.
say, don't put yourself back on mute. I think let's leave you unmuted
Okay.
as we carry on through the session, but please share your thoughts as well.
Yeah. But I'm married to a blind husband, so it means that as a deaf person, I live in a world at home where I'm navigating both deaf and visual, um, you know, restriction or opportunity, and so I am very thoroughly exploring, ways in which the spectrum of experience in my work can be expanded. Well, one thing I'm trying to do is whenever we're exploring making things more inclusive or varied, is that we always approach it from an artistic point of view rather than saying we need to facilitate access for these people because they can't, experience it. So we're looking at creating creative collaborations and seeing we want to create a piece of art with you so that we can explore this and taking it from that viewpoint. For I don't know about you, but I'm often getting requests in my inbox to go and attend an access consultation, and it takes the wind and the passion out of me immediately. And it's really important to, as artists, to collaborate with other artists in a creative way. And I think that mirrors what Joe and Aidan were saying. Um, but also, it's really important to fail at access as well, and to because so I did a massive show with the Welcome Collection this year, and I'll talk a bit about that later. But we used haptics for the first time, but because of the restriction and technology around that, to cater for the tens of thousands of people. So if you're going to use haptics in a show, tens of thousands of people are going to use this very limited ability of tech out there to facilitate, have that robust ability to maintain that level of use. And so we had to rely on gaming tech, that are designed for focused on the mass male gaming market and are designed for explosions and warfare sensation. So they're not designed for beautiful, nuanced, layered music and so on. But we did it anyway, even though it was slightly rubbish in lots of ways. We did it anyway because I knew that I was going to get the ability to try these haptics vests out on tens of thousands of people and get information about that from them, about, how it worked. And so I learned huge amounts, but that's because the Wellcome Collection allowed me to have that not perfect element within my show, rather than just say, we've got to case study this, we've got to do this long research project. We just threw it into the mix and see when we saw what happened. So I hope that more institutions allow, not perfect elements in their shows in order for it to progress and to grow, for haptics to improve and to be more thoughtful in how it connects with art and that kind of thing. I think it needs to happen more.
Brilliant. Thank you, Cathy. I mean, I really like that. I like the fact that actually you're um, using your artistic experiences and the pieces of work that you're making to really explore how you can use it. And actually, it doesn't always work. And tech quite often never truly works properly. And so you mine lots of data about how you can use it better the next time because you've used it the first time and you can kind of work out how you make it better for the next artistic response that you might be creating in the next project. Brilliant, thank you. And I'm just going to have a look and see what other questions we have. There was a question from Alan, who said to Joe, that have you got any other examples of any of your projects in terms of what you do? We have put Joe's link to his work in the chat, but I wonder if, aside from Cryptship, if there's another project off the top of your head that you kind of illustrates perfectly how you use tech as a medium to explore very quickly.
Yeah. So I did a project called The Medical Gaze, which examined the Wellcome Collection's archive of lithographs of doctors. And this was using technology effectively to process these images and was creating a interactive piece of work that's contrasted how the medical profession is represented as prestige within these lithographs, highly elitist, and how patients were represented as lowly subjects that were clearly in pain, anguish, and had no joy or status. And so the work effectively took these lithograph portraits of these doctors and cut them up, kind of like digital collage of all the eyes that follows you around the room, kind of recreating that feeling that's still present in the medical system of how the medical gaze sees the patient as a subject rather than a person and tries to fix them as opposed to asking them what they want.
Amazing, brilliant, thank you. With our next question, which is all about audiences. So, Aidan, I'm going to turn to you first. And I want to know, tell me a little bit more about your audience and how they experience your work. You talked about it earlier, but tell us more.
So in one way, my work is for everyone, but I know it's also not for everyone, just because of the type of work that I make. Um, if my work is care-based and embeds access and inclusion and justice, why would it be in effect inaccessible? It's after all like a human right to have and be part of a cultural life. And that's also why much of my work exists in the public domain, which is important for the way that my audience engages with my work. And when I think about how I'm to present the idea that I want to explore, I'm mindful that people always don't want to talk about mental health or climate change or the weather. I mean, I don't know why, but there's much seems to be other things that people want to go out for. And then therefore I need to give people different ways in to experience the work. So I'm thinking of like, for example, I was naked smelling of rain started out as an idea for to be an installation, but it ended up as being a 50-minute solo performance with sound and lights and projections, which then became a film and then an installation. Um, and so that there was different ways that people could engage with the work and explore the ideas. And in 2023, I was commissioned by Artichoke to make light installations for Lumiere Durham. And I made a large Wellington boot, an umbrella, a wind icon, for example. And for me, like a 3 or 4 meter children's Wellington boot is a very visual thing, but it's also a metaphor of hope, a reminder of fun and play, and a way to stay safe and dry in stormy weather, both real and kind of metaphorical or emotional. And I made them in the context of a work that I'd been doing with Chloe Meineck around machine learning and suicide prevention and the well you keeping the unwell you safe. And they were all at points of arrival and departure. And I was thinking of the emotional elements of journeys and the climate impact. Um, but the reality is that Lumiere is a light biennial with 250,000 people over the weekend. And families just want a nice night out to see some lights, and they don't want to think about climate change or emotions or big life events or social justice. So I try to make work that operates on different levels and different ways to engage with the same work. And ultimately, I guess I want my work to create an itch that needs scratching. And I have no wish to tell my audiences what to think or what to feel. Um, I know what I want them to think and want them to feel, but that is a very different thing. Um, and so, yeah, and I want people to return. I don't want it to be like a firework and then it's all, it's a bit of a moment of ooh, and then it's gone and you don't think about it. And that's why I want to create that itch. And also, I want people to think about like why have I used those materials? So, for example, with neon, it's a remarkably environmentally sustainable material, especially when you consider like the lifelong embedded energy and compare it to like how extractive something like LED is, for example. And so, yeah, and so whilst I don't make it for a certain cohort of people and for everybody, it's like I think it's important that you have to consider your audience when you are making work and give them different options to get into it. And whether that is at that moment or whether it is when they return to it. And there's a difference between experiencing something in a shopping center, for example, or a street or a park or a library and all, or other public spaces and understanding how people are in that space and behave as well as how they experience that work.
Thanks, Aidan. That's really interesting. I love how you have talked about a lot of things, and Cathy mentioned it earlier about layering. It's not just when you make the work, but it's also understanding how audiences then will access and experience that work. And with the kinds of topics that you're exploring, they're big. There's certain, vulnerability around, talking about mental health or climate action that by having it in a public space, it allows audiences to either enjoy the spectacle as you have done in big festivals, or to explore it with the subtlety and the sensitivity that could be quite intimate and playful. That's really lovely. And Joe, I'm going to turn to you. You mentioned that it's crucial for you to create the space for disabled people to play. Tell us more about who you make your work for and why that's important.
Yeah. Um, I I generally make my work for everyone, but it's always rooted in disability. I kind of see that effectively everyone, if they're lucky, will experience disability in their lives and already have if you consider a baby unable to function in the world without support and adaptation. So everyone gets to experience disability. Um, I think a lot of my recent work has been about exploring my own sense of disabled identity. I've spent most of my life being disabled. Yeah, I've not really thought or had much. I've never really understood necessarily what disabled joy is, what disabled fantasy is. And that's because I've had society's imprint of what disability is supposed to be put onto me. And so the act of play, the act of disabled imagination and fantasy is starting to challenge that. And that can be quite difficult, and that can be quite scary. And there's a cognitive barrier there. Like it's difficult to overcome that thing because it's a constant thing that is reinforced still in society, everyday experiences. So that's where play is a really nice space. And that's why the Cryptship project is around AI, because AI cannot imagine disabled people. Because if we look to where AI gets its training from, that comes from movies and TV and film literature, and they also can't imagine disabled people. It's still full of tropes around, it's still written in modern scripting books taught now, that if you want to make your character a baddie, give them a disability. So the audience kind of instantly goes, oh, disability, they're evil, right? So that's still present. So obviously it's going to be present in any technology that's based on it. And that having something like that within a game environment kind of triggers that break slightly of players going, well, like I want something this machine can't imagine. And that's where players start to tell stories together, because community is another helpful aspect of exploring identity, right? I like that definition of disabled pride being connecting with past and present lives of disabled people. So all sitting together and telling stories together and laughing around how these terrible generative machines can't imagine a wheelchair made out of jellyfish, while we all can, and we can all tell that story. And then we can also laugh about how bad it is and how it doesn't work, but how we support each other, how we work together as a group to form that story and that storytelling. From kind of non-disabled people who play the game, I think it's disabled people already know that these systems are discriminatory. I've never sat down with the disabled community and kind of played this game and not they already know it doesn't work. It works enough sometimes, but it also doesn't work well enough. But with non-disabled people, I think it's often the fact that they said they realize this technology is political, that it's biased, that it's trained on the worst possible content imaginable on the internet that was actively chosen to be incorporated into how they work. And so everyone has a lived experience which will be contradicted or in some way offended within these systems. So kind of, again, play is a good way to kind of have a journey that lets people laugh, lets people bond, lets people connect, stay together afterwards as well to talk about these things, but also deal with real thorny issues that these systems propagate biases. And often people don't realize it because Google, Microsoft, OpenAI don't want to tell you, right? It's not within their commercial imperative to explain the training data that's present within these systems. None of them do. And there's a reason they don't, right? So that's what we're, I guess, showing to everyone, is that these systems are political, and in breaking them is often how we see how they don't work and some of the exclusion and biases that are present within them. Yeah.
Brilliant. I love that. I love that actually. You've mentioned so many things there, about challenging those tropes, that set up in society. You encounter them when you're really young, when you first watch TV or you pick up a picture book, or and then they become set in as that's the thing, right? That's the norm, but actually it shouldn't be like that. And you're redefining, you're taking those rules that are set for the playing field and you're breaking those rules and redefining what that playing field is, but you're doing it with humor and make believe and allowing people to sit in that space, you know, uh, to find out what it means as a community to challenge those things. That's brilliant. That's absolutely brilliant. And Cathy, I wanted to move to you next. And you told me previously when we were talking that your work is for those from a deaf perspective first, and then for anyone else. So tell me a little bit more about that.
Well, um, as a deaf person, I kind of navigate a world which is hearing dominated, and there's a misconception that deaf people are inferior communicators because we can't hear. But the reality is that the way we communicate, I think, is more inclusive because we're more focused on communication rather than talking. And so it means that we're thinking about the whole of communication rather than just, the words. And we, the deaf community, were also the people who invented text communication, which is the primary form of communication internationally. So in the 60s, 50s, 60s, deaf people were the ones investigating that form of communication. So when I'm planning installations, I'm thinking about what's going to work for deaf people first and foremost, because that makes me think about how a space is shaped, how the light works, how the vibration works in the room, how intimidating this space is to go into if you don't know what's beyond. A lot of immersive environments are really scary places to walk into. People are led down dark tunnels into spaces in which they're suddenly taken into a dark room, and then there's very little safety in terms of how you navigate those spaces and how you sit or interact in them. There's a sense that you have to be awed by this, dark tunnel of this dark chamber that you appear to be trapped in. And, there's kind of like almost an escape room feel about a lot of immersive spaces. And so with the Welcome collection, when I was working with them and also with the Science Gallery, we took a deaf design viewpoint on the whole space, down to the seating, the shape of the room. We involved a deaf architect to design certain elements. So we had things like apertures brought into the design so that you could see into the immersive space from outside in the other gallery before you walked in, rather than having this big, intimidating wall of, contemporary art, and then having to walk around to sort of get into space. We were given a sort of glimpse within. Um, we thought about the textures, the carpets, everything was considered from a deaf perspective. And then the Welcome Collection didn't ask us, but we ended up taking over everything else. So we started working with the front of house. We worked with the marketing and PR teams. We worked with the cafe. Everything became a conversation around not access for deaf people, but how can deaf experience make your offer better. And so everybody started becoming infused with deaf experience within all of the different things they were doing around the building. And it was a very powerful experience for the Welcome Collection and the teams. And so for me, it's a straightforward thing to do things from the deaf perspective, but also it's about challenging on a more detailed level about how deaf heritage and deaf culture is contained within those institutions. So, for example, with the Welcome Collection, they had thousands of things within their collections, and the Science Museum as well, related to deaf people, but it was all medical equipment. So it was all hearing aids and that sort of side of things. And there was a lot of drawings and paintings by hearing people about deaf experience, but all of the subculture around, the social political movements of deaf experience from the Middle Ages to now was missing. And that was hidden in, personal archives, voluntary archives around the country, or in the vaults of university institutions that had never engaged with any of that material. So none of the political writing of 100 years ago featured, but some of the work of Alexander Graham Bell, who was a significant oppressor of deaf people, was championed within these archives. So they're a very skewed and incorrect capture of what deaf experience was within those collections. So with Finger Talk, we were seeking to ensure that the other perspective of deaf experience was visible. And what's interesting is when this was proposed, so that we would show 100-year-old films of sign language, that we would subvert audiograms to show how how normal hearing is depicted in birdsong and leaf, and deaf people are depicted in this bad land of, fighter jets and lawnmowers and motorbikes, and how to subvert that into showing how actually the deaf community, is like a murmuration of birds that travels around the world, adapting and evolving. It has no geographical base, but it's connected through its shared experience and through sign language. And we wanted to show that. But the questions were, when I proposed that, to create this installation that captured all of these very detailed things, the history of sign language to the Middle Ages, these historic films from 100 years ago, all of these things, I was told, but will people want to come and see that? Because it's very specific and it's only going to appeal to deaf audiences. And so I had to say, well, this hasn't really been coming anywhere else. It's not been something that's been done. So what are you basing that on? What are you basing that understanding that your hearing audiences are not going to want to come to this? And how do you learn whether or not that's the case? And so it turned out that 32,000 people were interested in coming to see this installation, and the majority of the audiences were non-deaf. And we got a huge amount of visitor data from that process as well. So I think, rooting it in from deaf perspective or disability perspective doesn't necessarily mean it's not going to be appealing or engaging or exciting to the masses. And the more that work like Finger Talk and other installations do to get that platform, the more that evidence, comes about.
Brilliant. Thank you, Cathy. So much in what you've just said there, from, the assumptions that, looking into historical archives about the deaf experience won't be of interest to mainstream audiences, and actually it is. It's absolutely fascinating to see how, deaf people have always been a part of innovating and creating history and culture. And, like you say, you had masses of audiences that came to experience the show. And that proves that actually those moments in history that create those pieces of work, they shouldn't be erased or they shouldn't be hidden. They absolutely should be there for everybody to experience. Cathy is coming back. Don't worry, we're just finding a workaround for the technical glitches. There we go. She's back. And I also really like the way that you think about when you're making your work on every level of detail. In terms of not just the artistic experience in the space that you might be creating that work, but then also getting those organizations and those institutions to really think about how the deaf experience can enhance their offer, so actually becomes about you creating work, but then it becomes about all of those levels of detail, like you said, from the carpet and the textures to what happens when people come in. And that's exactly, what we now kind of sit in, which is the user experience for how we do experience art and culture, which is fascinating. Brilliant. And also, I think you've all mentioned actually, while you've been talking, how your work is not only challenging those assumptions, but also it's political. It's not the small p anymore, it's the big P. Art is a space to be political. And I think that's absolutely fascinating. We've got some questions from the chat, which I'm just going to go through now before we go to our final questions. Okay. So a question from Laura, which is specifically to Cathy. Laura's heard about Night Bloom that you showcased at Market Hall in Plymouth, and she'd love to hear more about the R&D experience of using 360 tech for storytelling. So how has that format challenged and supported your creative vision for the piece?
Oh, well, thanks for bringing that one up. So that's very recent. In October, we created that. It was never intended for that environment. So we had to take a piece of work that was designed for a totally different building, a different context, and somehow change it to be 360. I don't recommend doing that. I recommend doing something from scratch for that environment because it was really hard to do that. Um, but the technical side is basically you're trying to create something for a dome. So you've got to think about the hat, and you've got to think about it like a cake, and then think about what's on the hat of this space, and then what's on the sides, and then you build up, the vision for it. It's really challenging to think in 360, but also really exciting as well. And the venue did say to us, we really love how you use that space, how you really embrace the opportunity to do things in 360. So, for example, we had a storm, a hand-drawn storm that we'd created, and we decided to just envelope the whole of the ceiling in the storm, so you felt like you were literally in this hand-drawn storm. So it was really powerful. But it's surprising how possible it is because you'd think, oh, this is going to be really hard, but it is possible once the framework of how you have to build the space within the computer program that we use, and how feasible it is. And that's why I want to kind of encourage to go not think that you are limited by your lack of technology knowledge, or that you can't work within those spaces, that you have to be super clever or super knowledgeable about certain software programs and so on, because we were able to bring together something that was very with hand drawn, literally, and then change it into this massive immersive piece. But one thing I would say, there were lots of limitations around it about how you create something that's ticketed, because it had to be ticketed, whereas before we've always done very incidental things where people sort of wander in down the street, happen upon our work, or they're able to drop in and out or watch it as many times as they wanted. So it's a new experience for us to limit how long people could sit within that space. There were challenges around the floor being very solid so that you didn't get that vibrational music, in the space that we would have wanted. So we'd like to see to work with different floor or haptic floor, or lots of things we learnt from the process of making that work. Um, but once you have the right team in place, anyone can work within a 360-degree space. Anyone could take that on. It is feasible. It is possible for us all to be working in those spaces, and we should be, going out and getting on with it.
Brilliant. Thank you, Cathy. And a question to all three of you from Lynn. What are the barriers that artists with disabilities face in the process of creating your artwork? And so Lynn really wants to hear about your thoughts on the current climate on residencies or production processes expected by institutions, and from the artist's perspective. I'll say the question again. What are the
I can
barriers
go.
that Okay, great. Thank you,
I
Aidan.
mean, I think, I mean, it's complex because, culture is under attack, like, in a universal kind of way, and funding is short, and, the extra expense that is incurred by disabled artists just makes it difficult to, plus if you're going on away residencies, then you have to think about like your health or, other considerations about your access team and things like that. But I think one of the barriers, and like Kathy's, is talking about much larger scale. It's like how do disabled artists kind of scale up? And Kathy's the exception to make these like large scale public works. And it's like how do I think generally when I was curating or co-curating the Towards New Worlds with Mima, a lot of the issues were that disabled artists didn't have studios. They were making work in their kitchens or on the floor, and therefore they were largely invisible. And it's not because their work is lesser or our work is not as good. It's just the fact that we tend to be less visible. And people, go on studio visits and have these exhibitions, and all the systems around the art world and the public art world there's full of systemic barriers to disabled people, whether that is like finance or the times of working or the opportunities and the funding and, and the ability to scale up. And it's like that, it's like a big onion that, the more you get into it. And so it's difficult, it was difficult as a curator who was actually wanting to find a whole load of disabled artists to actually find them and then go and have studio visits and curate, and that invisibility is a real issue before you even get to scale, ambition, opportunity.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Aidan, about like, how do you make sure that you're finding the artists that you're trying to commission or program, um, and making the effort to do that.
And then there's the aversion to risk, and and if you haven't had the opportunity, how do people know that you're a safe pair of hands? And because like nobody wants to fail, whereas like I think that failure, like Cathy was saying, has its benefits.
Absolutely. And anyone else want to respond to Lynn's question?
I think I would add that the thing that saddens me most to specifically think about residencies is in a COVID period of time, residencies became massively accessible for disabled people and suddenly removed the need to travel or go and spend 2 or 3 weeks in a venue, and everyone adapted, and then that all went away. So I would ask why and what the purpose of these systems are if they're not enabling the access needs of the people who are participating.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's really interesting about like you see these big moments that change the way that we operate, and then the kind of behavior which is to revert back to how it was before, which Joe, you've explained absolutely on point. And so there's a responsibility as an organization or a funder to go, how do we saw by doing something differently that we were attracting different audiences or finding new artists who were creating new pieces of work, and we were supporting those artists by having access riders and tech riders and extended timelines for programs to run so that artists have the time to make that work. And how can we now embed those behaviors, and then crucially, like from the spaces point of view, how do we share that knowledge so that actually it becomes something that can be shared as best practice, so it's not just something that's done well and then never replicated or only replicated by one organization, but done well and shared so that it can be picked up by lots of other willing and hungry organizations who absolutely do want to commission artists like yourselves who are making new work and doing it in interesting ways. So I think there's a responsibility from us as well as finding artists like yourselves to be able to challenge those systems, which leads us perfectly into I think a really big question, which again, you've all been talking about as you've been telling us about your work and your processes, which is really about changing behavior. So Joe, I'm going to go to you first, if that's okay. And you have already talked about changing behavior and challenging assumptions. Tell me a little bit more about how your work challenges the systems and behaviors around disability and normative practice.
Yeah,
Big question.
it's a big question. Try and get my thoughts. So I think that there's a few good, there's a few kind of like think tanks or like polling done by people like YouGov, which looked at how there's a public assumption that technology, specifically it was around AI, will be great for helping disabled people. And I think a lot of my work is challenging that narrative. How sewing machines were promised to clothe the world, but we got sweatshops. Programming was supposed to mean there would be loads of jobs for disabled people, but companies all started outsourcing them and paying a pittance. We see it again with generative AI systems, where effectively they are discriminatory and being forced on people without choice. And we're told it's for good, but who's good? So my work is asking those questions and challenging narratives that suggest this is for the greater good when it concentrates power rather than redistributing it, and for a very few number of people. I think also any system which sees people and land as units of productivity, disabled people by having non-conformist bodies are already kind of anti-capitalist. And I think in a current climate where climate change is not being addressed, where technology is being presented which removes jobs, and the obsession with growth, with the obsession with growth, as opposed to valuing people, I think is shown in so much of what happens in government levels, of how when we have discussions around how AI systems can be used in government, there aren't disabled communities involved in those discussions. They don't ask, say, the Joseph Rowntree Institute to discuss from a poverty perspective how these systems affected. They ask 3 or 4 tech companies, including completely unethical companies like Palantir, to have that discussion. So my work is asking, disabled people are not niche. This is not like a small issue. Look to history as how productivity lenses have hurt people. I've already given examples. The Luddites is another example of workers who are treated horrifically by people extracting profits. This is a global issue. I go around the world kind of like talking about resisting AI, and this is something that a lot of people want that no one is providing. And it's unsurprising the disabled community, I would say, is leading the way in pushing back against the systems, because they're used to this. They're used to having to push back against these things. So what I'm trying to do, and what I hope I'm trying to do, is my perspective is that resistance is real. You can resist. It's community. I am trying to build community with my work, because that's how you resist any form of technology forced on people. And to at least ask, like, if you ignore the disabled community, like, that's on you. That idea, disability saves society from big technology. If disabled people were listened to, we could potentially have a very different future. And I want the disabled community at least to be like, well, we told you, you just didn't listen.
I love that. I love that. And you've talked about such enormous systems of power, which I think sometimes we don't challenge, or we don't even question it, like, with this fascination with tech, this big silicon tech companies, and how governments, like you mentioned, are focusing on growth. But actually the whole point of your work about, questioning how power needs to be redistributed, and how resistance can do that. I think it's really, really powerful, in terms of redefining what these new avant-garde communities of the future are, and how you're creating the space for everyone to be in that. And I think that's really, really important. And I know I've mentioned this in webinars before, and Cathy mentioned it. The innovation comes from those pushing back and resisting against those things that are set in place as normal behaviors, text messaging, which was invented pretty much from the pushback from the deaf community that Cathy, you mentioned, and voice notes and, audio books that comes from, blind people and those with visual impairments saying, actually, we want a different way to experience literature, and now it's common form and behavior that's how we consume content and culture. Absolutely brilliant. Thank you, Joe. Cathy, we're going to move on to you. When we spoke before, you mentioned how it's important that disabled artists don't wait for permission. Tell us why and how this is challenging assumptions about disability and disabled artists.
I think that a lot of, or if not all, disabled and deaf artists, they experience a lot of trauma through their professional careers. So they've been in situations, circumstances where they've had a really difficult experience, and that creates trauma in how they operate and how they go about future works and commissions. And I want to acknowledge that, and that has a big impact. It's and it's a lot of people focus on the access barriers and the cost of access, but the biggest barrier for me is the intellectual barrier, the snobbery barrier, the ingrained irritation of major arts institutions have towards having to deal with access. And I've been in spaces where people are not aware that I am deaf, um, and witness, the reality of how people think and how why they're making choices. And that's quite a difficult one for me to kind of sit with. And I had to find a way for me to be able to progress. How do I build my company knowing that I'm going to be encountering and facing these really devastating acts of ableism everywhere I went? We had a massive setback last year when a major work that we had prepared for an arts institution, it was all done, bells and whistles. We'd spent 6 weeks planning a scaffold. We had all the necessary requirements in place. We had the whole, we'd had everything down to how the streets were going to be cleaned afterwards, the health and safety, everything was done. But then the leader of the institution had a problem with the fact that two disabled women were leading the project, and had assumed that someone was going to come in and oversee things, to look after us basically, and decided to pull the plug. They used another reason, but then we were forwarded a chat thread in which the real reason they'd pulled the plug had been revealed. So I'm just sharing you this very, you know, awful thing that happened, because people don't talk about failure and these things happened. It's all swept under the carpet, but it's really, sorry, it's really common thing to happen, that, these moments of trauma came up. And what we had to do was to lose that amazing piece of work we'd put together, that we'd worked for 2 years on. We lost it and rebuild it and find somewhere else for it to go. We didn't let that experience prevent us from, holding it and keeping it going and finding somewhere else for it to go. And we did find that space, because we felt that it wasn't their right to take it from us. It wasn't their right to make that decision. But often these little really difficult moments of ableism in conversations that pop up all the time. I had a meeting last week where someone in the meeting said to me something, and I'm still thinking about it. I'm still processing, because it was an ableist comment without them realizing, but I'm still processing it, and it's preventing me from working through that particular project. So as disabled artists carry all of this all the time, and they're dealing with access to work as well, which is, really making everyone quite ill at the moment. And so enabling, giving yourself the right to not ask permission to create your work and to put it into spaces, and to find places where you can put your work out there is so crucial. And to so I've been, in some places I'm finding complete walls, complete barriers, very patronizing, attitudes. And I'm going out there and finding other places to put our work. So, for example, I'm finding historic buildings, organizations within this country quite hard to get into. But we instead started working with independent historic buildings instead. And we did a projection earlier this year with an amazing independent institution, because we were not getting interest from the major organisations in the heritage sector. So it's about, finding ways in which you can galvanise yourself in the face of all of this, abuse, and discrimination, finding spaces that you control and you own and you shape. So you give, even if it's just a really small thing, a small installation or a small space that you've crafted and your safe space, and then you can go back out and you engage with all these institutions that are so challenging to work with. I don't know if any of that makes sense, but this is how we've been operating. We've got these dual programs. Some are our our work that we've made happen from scratch on our terms in the spaces that we've decided upon, and the other programs where we're going, dealing with this constant, you know, oh, um, difficult mess of conversations that we've got to have to get them to where they need to be in order to keep our heart and soul alive within our work. So yeah.
Yeah. I mean, that's I typed that down, Cathy, when you said just encountering the devastating acts of ableism and discrimination on a daily basis, and then actually, the fact that you're not just trying to make work as an artist, but you're having to dig deep and rely on your inner resilience and your determination to make the work so that it becomes visible and that so that people can see it. That's quite astonishing. Thank you for sharing that. Um, and Aidan, I'm going to turn to you. You mentioned that your work clearly has big themes, and that you hope people will be able to explore those in the way that suits them best within your work. So tell us more about the role of tech and how it shifts perspectives on disability, mental health, and well-being. And you've touched on all of those things.
Okay. So well, as I said, I generally use tech as a way to engage rather than it being the form of engagement. And it's generally not something that I or my audience are passive recipients of. Um, my work embeds care and access, and it's like, and I'm thinking sometimes activism is chaining yourself to things, and sometimes it's buying shares. And and then I'm also, mindful of like how disabled or communication tools for disability during COVID, and they were dismissed, and then because they were businessified and they were reappropriated or appropriated and rebranded and recapitalized and therefore valued, um, you know, they changed and now we all use them, and it's like how it's that colonialization of the disabled space, which, I don't want things to be like, if we keep them hidden, then that maintains the status quo. And so I'm thinking about like, so trying to like normalize some of these issues that we deal with and not compartmentalize them or silo them. And so like, for example, I'm thinking of like the work that I made, Sargassity, which is a periodic table of emotions, which acts as a barometer of well-being for whatever location it's in. And this is like a large-scale digital installation. So people interact with it to register their emotions and how they're feeling, either generally or to specific prompts. And initially it was used through Twitter. But then when Twitter became like so toxic from the brilliant community that it used to be, it was like then it was politically, I couldn't use it. So now like we like looked at the tech, and now it's touch screen. And that's the thing about like a lot of my work is also it's never really finished because it has to keep evolving to be relevant to like the contemporary times that we're in. And then using like tech as a way to think about things and to bring about these kind of social change. So if we're thinking about like mental health and in a city, and why are people might be saying that they're depressed or frustrated or sad or angry, and it might be because there's too much graffiti or too few trees. And then if people get together and then they plant trees and then they clean the graffiti, it's like the mental health improves because they're investing in where they are, which improves our well-being. They're with a like-minded community, which improves our well-being and mental health. And then there's more trees, which makes them happier because they like trees, but also it has a good effect on well-being. And so it's using like tech as a tool, as a catalyst. It's and also because my work exists in the public domains or spaces, it brings those issues into the everyday. Like we don't really talk about feelings. We ask each other, "Oh, how are you doing?" But we're really already on to the next question because we're not really bothered about how people are, or we don't have the time to find out how people are. And it normalizes those questions and encourages listening and dialogue and conversation. And also, it gives the ability for those voices which are usually absent in conversations to be present. And by normalizing it or everydayizing it, it destigmatizes it. It takes it out of the medical and into the social spaces. And, so yeah, I think largely I try to use the technology as a tool or a gateway for an easy in or easy out for what sometimes are perceived as very difficult or taboo subjects, such as loneliness or grief or emotions or climate, and sometimes which can feel too huge. So, um, if we take the elements from the periodic table of emotions and put them on beer mats, and then suddenly we're talking about feelings in a bar, rather than feelings in a doctor's room or whatever. And it's like, and if we increase our emotional lexicon, then we increase our well-being. And it's like, it's trying to find ways or tools that we can, yeah, that has a function rather than just being something in it and of itself. So, on one hand, yes, it's a big light installation, but also it's a real tool for to being as granular as you like. And then so the periodic table of emotions, I adapted it for COP26, and then it became all about climate justice and climate emotions and realize, disabled people are disproportionately impacted by climate change and the effects of climate change, but we're disproportionately absent from the dialogue. Like we're 4 times more likely to die in a natural environmental disaster, either directly or because we're left to die because we're an afterthought. And so it opens up those, it's not just climate justice, it's disability justice, it's social justice, because it's not just disabled people, then it goes to the people who are less able to survive. And then actually it involves everybody.
Brilliant. That's really, really fascinating, Aidan. I think you've explained that so clearly about the inaccessibility of tech and the colonization of disabled spaces, as you all have actually, and how you're all reclaiming the ownership of those spaces and using tech and tools as a catalyst, to have those really, really big conversations. That's really, really enlightening. We're a few minutes over. But we do have one last question, so bear with us, audience. And this is a really important question, so I don't want to cut it from the session because it's kind of like it's about the future. So let me ask the panel the final question. And again, if you could kind of in one sentence maybe or two sentences, tell us what does the future look like for you? And Cathy, I'm going to go to you first.
The future for me is that Spectroscope is invited to be the headline, act within a city of culture or within a major, program within the UK because we're ready for that. We're equipped for that. We have the fantastic network of deaf and disabled expertise to make that happen. There's no reason why it can't happen. So that's the future for me. And that's where I'm going. And maybe people out there aren't ready for that. Yes, maybe they're not ready, but we're ready. So I think we'll get there with it eventually. I'm feeling confident.
Brilliant. Thank you, Cathy. I look forward to you being a headline act at the next City of Culture. If anyone is listening in the chat, take note. And if we go to Aidan next, what does the future look like for you?
Well, hopefully it means completing my PhD soon in the new year. And then I want to get back to my art practice. And so I've got a residency at the art house. And going back to kind of when I became disabled, the art house were one of the first places where I went around disability arts and did a residency there in the print room. And so I'm kind of, yeah, I'm returning to print and photography and making work.
Brilliant. Thank you, Aidan. That sounds really lovely. And then finally to you, Joe, what does the future look like for you?
Um, I think Cathy kind of mentioned it, not waiting, telling stories, not waiting for someone to write our stories, telling our own stories, and building communities, tunneling out space where we can belong.
Brilliant. That's amazing. And I look forward to hearing more of those stories from you too, Joe. And that's it. That's a wrap. Thank you to all of our amazing panel. Thank you to the audience that have been here and to Vicky and Jenna. I just want to say that, to Aidan and Joe and Cathy, the audience, you've seen a really a tiny little glimpse of the incredible work that these artists are making. And there's tons of you, so many disabled artists that are innovating and pushing form and breaking boundaries, challenging assumptions, redefining creative possibility, and inviting us as audiences to experience culture in bold and exclusive and interactive and new ways. And I'm reminded that Socrates once said, the secret of change is to focus all of your energy not on fighting the old, but on building the new. And that really is the space of innovation and art that remaps the very fabric of culture and who is included, who is making it, and how we all inhabit it. Thank you very much. Absolutely.